What I've been asked to do is just capture a number of key issues surrounding the notion and practicalities of community organising and what the future might look like. Now, one of my main interests is looking at community organising from the union side, whilst not forgetting the community side of the equation. I'm particularly interested in what I call trade union strategic choice. So the way unions engage and what any kind of future engagement might look like depends very much on the strategic choices that trade unions make. Now that might seem a bit obvious actually, but I'm not entirely sure that certainly from my research and looking at literature that unions who've indicated that they want to develop a community dimension have really considered it in as much detail as they should have been. I'm involved with a couple of unions at the minute who have a community dimension, and they're both struggling, I think, to clarify precisely what do they mean by community unionism actually, and how does that engagement take place. So from the wider literature and my own experience, there are three, and this is a very broad brush, there are three, I think, strategic orientations that trade unions can take when they want to engage with community organisations or groups in society at large. And one is and terminology is debated and disagreed with, but we can put that to one side. There's one form of engagement which you might call an ad hoc kind of opportunistic, instrumental engagement. And this might come around where, and it could become perfectly logical, perfectly honourable, if a plant, if a works or an office closes down, where a trade union might say, well, look, we need broader support within a community. But it's instrumental in the sense that the trade union is perhaps using the community organisation, who might be willingly used. And it's very short-lived. There's no development of ongoing networks or connections. It's very short-lived, instrumental. Second kind of engagement might be what you might call a kind of common cause involvement. So here it's when the trade union and the community organisation both identify a similar cause. So it's not just one-sided, as it were. And this is a kind of a middle ground in terms of developing a cohesive, perhaps longer-lasting arrangement. Because there's a common cause, then there's perhaps some kind of structure takes place. Some structure is developed. Union leaders, activists communicate, and the kind of arrangement can be more long-lived than for the instrumental type. The third type is an interesting type. It perhaps exists in certain forms in the States, where you might call it a transformational or a deep or integrative form of community engagement. And this is where the structure moves beyond common cause, and where the two sides have identified a common cause for sure, the common cause which can only really be propagated and developed if there's a deeper organisational arrangement. You can have a couple of different forms of this deep form of community union, if you like. One is where you might have a kind of a social movement around an anti-globalization kind of issue. Another is where you might have a structure around a living wage issue, for example, or in the States a workers' centre. So that's very, very broad brush. I think you can envisage, both conceptually and in practice, different depths of engagement. And the depth of engagement depends not simply on opportunistic or moments in time which you might not anticipate. There is a bit of that for sure. What I'm suggesting is, if we're looking into the future, how community organisations, community union structures, coalitions might evolve, really it depends very much upon the well thought out strategic choices that unions make. And what I'm suggesting is perhaps they don't consider these issues as widely as they should. What I want to do now is just very briefly talk about a few specific issues which I think are potentially problematic for trade unions and, of course, for community organisations themselves. So it seems that coalitions, evidence suggests coalitions are more successful when a common cause simultaneously connects to what might be called a common good. So something which is perceived by society at large, or by a community at large, as being a good which is beyond the immediate specific common cause. And this has a synergistic bonding impact. And one of the consequences for unions is because there's a common good which is wider than what a union might typically be involved in. It seems as if unions really need to accept that they need to take a step back and not control. Now, that might seem terribly logical, but because of the nature of British trade unions, all trade unions, there is an issue there, in that union structures, decision-making processes, the desire for control, power arrangements, bureaucracy, hierarchy, unions are not very good at letting go. Leaders have taken a long time to become leaders. Why on earth would they let go? And also there's a dynamic issue here in that community organisations, community issues tend to need to be fluid, need to be dynamic, where union structures tend to be bureaucratic. It takes a long time, doesn't it, to make decisions. Many union leaders are, let's be honest, conservative with a small c, some actually probably with a large c, but we won't go into that. And also, there's no question that for many union organisations, they would see community organisations connecting with potential recruits as trespassing on their terrain. And this kind of pulls unions back from engaging more widely. Also, community work tends to be contested activity over power for social change. This raises all kinds of issues. Trade unions, by and large in the UK, are what you might call insiders. They tend to work with councils, with the Labour Party, with established groups in civil society. Many community initiatives require outsider activity, where these established institutional arrangements are challenged. Very uncomfortable for many trade unions and leaders. Political action, is often required that goes actually beyond what the Labour Party would want. So many unions, as you all know, are tied umbilically to the Labour Party, whereas many community actions involve thinking ideologically beyond the Labour Party. Many community activists are not wedded to the Labour Party. They actually see trade unions and the Labour Party, and all political parties, as being part of the problem. And many unions are, in my experience, without naming names or unions, are pathologically hostile to politics which isn't Labour Party. That's a real stumbling block, I would suggest. So political education, evidence suggests, is absolutely crucial. You look at community organising, political education is very important, which is challenging to many in the trade union movement. One final stumbling block, which I've observed and it's been catalogued, is an issue, is many union activists are quite left-wing. So when they come into contact with community organisers who are involved in faith organisations, it can be an issue. It can be an issue. So I'll just leave it with one final point, is that what's been suggested by a number of writers on community unionism and coalitions, and this is an interesting point for unions to consider, is that unions need to break out of a narrow union identity and a sole focus on the employment relationship in order for them to effectively develop these deep-seated, integrative community organisations. If you think that through, well, if that is the case, if unions cease to focus entirely on the employment relationship, well, are they any longer trade unions? Have they become some kind of quasi-political parties? I'll leave it at that. I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you very much for that.